Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for making the time to come together to discuss this really pressing matter today. Before I begin, well, I want to introduce myself. My name is Tai Nguyen. I am a policy researcher for the RAND Corporation, as well as a research associate at the Proctor Institute. And I want to just first thank the Proctor Institute for sponsoring this event. Just a little bit about the Proctor Institute. The Samuel DeWitt Proctor Institute for Leadership, Equity, and Justice is a national center that focuses on issues of leadership, equity, and justice within the context of higher education. It brings together researchers, practitioners, and community members to work toward the common goals of diversifying leadership, enhancing equity, and fostering justice for all. So thank you all at the Proctor Institute for providing us with this platform and space to have this really important conversation. And also special thanks to Brandy, who has been letting you all in, Brandy Jones, for organizing all of this and for making things run smoothly. So thank you again, Brandy, much appreciation. Today's event, titled Anti-Asian Hate and Anti-Asian or Anti-Racism in Higher Education, is a conversation that I'm sure many of you are familiar with the constant rise of anti-Asian violence that communities across this country are encountering. And we're trying to really focus that conversation within the higher education space today. And so we have three very fabulous speakers who are faculty and practitioners from a variety of different regions across the country that I will introduce. Our first panelist is Arlene Das Magbual. Did I say that right, Darlene? I want to make sure.
You did. Thank you.
I did. Good. Arlene is the Director of Asian American and Pacific Islander Student Services, as well as a faculty member of the Asian American Studies program at San Francisco State University. And then we have Marcia Liu, who is a licensed counseling psychologist, as well as a mental health coordinator for the Hunter College Annapese Project. And she is also a faculty member of the Asian American Studies program at Hunter College in New York City. And then lastly, we have Timothy Fong, who is a professor of ethnic studies, as well as a director and principal investigator for the Full Circle Project, located at the California State University in Sacramento. Thank you all for being here and for making the time to share your insights and sort of expertise with us today. Just to give the audience a little bit of sense of what we're going to do today, I have a slew of questions, hopefully not really any major curveballs for the panelists, to discuss, again, the major issues that we're seeing today as it relates to Asian Americans and the violence that many of our communities are encountering. And then later on in today's conversation, we'll open it up to engage with you all, the audience, with any questions that you might have. Before I begin, I also do want to acknowledge that, the panelists don't necessarily represent all of American higher education. Many of them are located in very specific regions and are based at four-year institutions. So what I do hope during the Q&A is that we will have members of the community college community that can also sort of speak to the issues that they're seeing as well as it relates to today's topic. All right. All right, so let me start off with a pretty open question to you all. The first question is, what types of experiences are Asian American students, faculty, and staff having in college right now as it relates to the recent hate crimes that we're seeing? Maybe I can have Marcia start us off.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much, Ty. And thanks everybody for being here. I'm delighted to be participating with all of you and engaging in this discussion. So when I think about students from a New York City standpoint, I'm thinking there's first clearly so much fear, so much vigilance. Most students are having to be around other people. It's really hard to isolate in this city. And so taking the subway, walking down the streets, just there's a general sense of bearing themselves, just making sure that they're ready for something that could happen. I think that there's, for a lot of students who are immigrants, and also for students who haven't really thought of the racialization of Asian Americans in the past, this feels like a new moment for them. This feels like a moment of recognizing that as Asian Americans, they've been thought of as outsiders for hundreds of years in this country. And depending on where they are in their racial identity development, this feels somewhat new for a lot of our students. Other students feel like, yeah, we've watched this kind of develop, whether it was 100 years ago, whether it was 50 years ago, whether it was during Vietnam, whether it's post 9/11 with South Asian Americans being really targeted. I think they can kind of see how these themes we keep kind of trading off who's in the spotlight. And they're trying to kind of intellectually and emotionally sort through that while also preparing themselves for this trauma. So it's a lot that's happening at the same time. I think there's also some confusion about, I think that there's been a lot of news that's been very sensationalized about other people of color being the perpetrators of these attacks, especially in New York City. And there's this desire to really engage with that conversation, and really like try to think about this from a more nuanced perspective, but also at the same time, again, physically, bearing themselves when they go outside. So I think it's like a lot happening all at once, and really very much hungry for that conversation.
Great. Thanks, Marcia. Tim or Arlene?
Yeah, I can go next, but yeah, the experiences obviously have impacted everybody on campus, faculty, students, and staff. It is obviously a topic that's discussed a lot and concerns. We've had forums on our campus, and obviously classrooms engage with this as well, especially the Asian American Studies courses. There's a lot of confusion generally in California, and I'm not to speak for California. I'm not sure what's going on at other campus, regionally, but excuse me, about opening up in the fall. I mean, there's just generally confusion about, are we still going to be online? Are we face to face? And things change all the time. And it's hard to say exactly on our campus right now. But let me just use an example of in Sacramento, the Sacramento Unified School District. They are opening up, and they've announced they're opening up in fall. But there have been reports in the news that 70% of Asian students do not want to come back. And that's totally opposite of other populations, which is generally about 30 don't want to come back and 70 want to come back. And so the question, of course, is why is that the case? Why specifically that? And it's not the only reason, but I can't imagine it's not part of the reason, and maybe a major part of the reason is just concerns about safety. And that's not just kids, but parents especially. And I have spoken to some parents, and there have been some news articles about this, where parents will say, I remember what it was like being harassed and mistreated at school. I don't want that to happen to my kids. And all those memories have returned. And in not only for themselves, but for their kids, for their parents, especially. So it is community trauma. And I understand that I can't speak for everybody, not the whole population. And it is interesting too, because some of the data that has been coming out with Stop API Hate is, really 2/3 of the victims of hate have been women. And you see in the news, older people. The big concern is it could affect younger people. I mean, it's the most vulnerable. And Sacramento, I'll just end with this, is that in 1989, Stockton schoolyard shooting in Stockton, California, an assailant went to an elementary school that was predominantly Southeast Asian, went army fatigues and an assault rifle, and fired into a school, killing five kids. Ages youngest was 5, the oldest was 9, and over 30 were wounded. And that's a memory that has been brought up a lot, especially after Atlanta, where the concern is, we've all heard of driving while black, DWB, but for Asians, it's walking while Asian, working while Asian, doing, basically not doing anything and potentially being a victim. And it's that unknownness, it's that concerns so many people.
Thanks, Tim and Marcia, I really appreciate you all sort of locating these events within like the broader historical context, that these are events that we've seen really over time in this country's history, that it's not a new, phenomenon that we're seeing. And Arlene, are you seeing, would you say you're experiencing similar or very different sort of experiences on your campus at San Francisco State?
Yeah, thanks, Ty. I agree. I mean, a lot of the things that Marcia and Tim have said, a lot of racial trauma and grief happening with both our students, staff, faculty, and administrators here on campus. And we all know that this isn't new, and I think the trauma is also this intergenerational trauma that we're feeling, that it also happened to a generation before us. It also happened to generations back in our home countries, right? Really thinking about what that looks like with the oppression in our home countries and why we're here, in the United States. And so I think this is bringing up a lot of things that are in our bodies. And so when we hosted forums with our students and faculty and staff and administrators, we really wanted to understand how they were feeling. One, because we needed to acknowledge the pain that they're going through, even if they're not specifically targeted, right? But when they see someone on TV or on social media that looks like their grandpa or looks like their uncle or their aunt or their mother, or their friend or themselves, right? They need a space to actually acknowledge that. And so we provided these spaces on campus to hold that racial grief and that racial trauma. But we also wanted to understand, like, what can we do as a university to respond to it, right? And so, like, we wanted these forums and these town halls to kind of hold that space, but at the same time, those spaces should be held every day in the classrooms. Those things need to be acknowledged every day, when you open up the class and you ask people how they're doing. And many of the times our students have said that there wasn't any spaces for them to really say what they were feeling or the fear that they have in coming back to in-person learning. Right. And even with our faculty, staff, and administrators, right? Like, what is it going to be like when we have to commute back to school? And we've already had some incidents of people going, through public transportation and being attacked. Right. And in San Francisco, there was, if you look at the Stop API Hate website, there was a lot of incidents happening here in the Bay Area, and just recently we heard one about an elderly man being robbed and attacked by an 11-year-old and a 17-year-old. And bringing my own kids back to school this past month has raised a lot of fear within my own children, and what is the response though? So if these things happen on campuses, what is the response and the responsibility and the accountability of, like, the university or the schools? And so I think there's a range of emotions happening, but there's also this call to action and accountability. So instead of waiting for something to happen, right, an incident to occur, like, we really need to understand, what do we do to prevent that? Mm-hmm. What are some things that we have in place, and what are some barriers that we really need to reckon with?
Mm-hmm. Arlene, thanks so much. And I kind of want to zero in on what you said earlier about, institutions acknowledging the sort of trauma and grief that many of our communities are going through. And it seems like institutions can't really do much until they've started at that very fundamental point. And my question for the three of you is, given the proliferation of very common misconceptions about Asian American communities in this country, how can institutions overcome those misconceptions so that they can acknowledge, the trauma that we're going through, so that they can begin to actually develop appropriate solutions to those issues?
I'll go ahead and start here. I think it begins with, when you say misconceptions, at least understand, being able to acknowledge what's going on initially. And I'm curious to find out from the audience how, say, the Atlanta shootings and the rise of anti-Asian hate has been discussed on campus, or particularly by leadership. And for example, on our campus, our president sends messages out all the time, but around Black Lives Matter, around police shootings, around anti-immigrant sentiment, and obviously the last 4 years there were a lot of messages related to that, and so there's I think good that our president wants to speak out on these issues. And I remember right after the Atlanta shooting, first thing I did was actually contact our university, the director of vice president for university communications. I said, I hope the president's going to say something about this. And the vice president of communication is an Asian American woman, and she's actually one person who's really been heavily impacted by this. So it got done. I mean, the next day, the president had a very strong message acknowledging the racism. And I do know there's some cases where, either it's not talked about by administration, at least publicly, or they sort of like not as clear necessarily. Where our president was very clear, there's always a debate, is it a hate crime or not, and this kind of stuff. And I don't want to belabor that. I mean, or debate that. I mean, the president said it's a hate crime, and was working, wanted to work with different units on campus. And this is right when we started doing a lot of the sessions for faculty, staff, and students for hearings, because that has been done for various other groups. This actually was the first time that I can think of, I could be wrong, but it's the first time something specifically for API students.
I could jump in next if that's okay.
Sure.
I think over at SF State, I mean, we had the president send a letter to our colleges. There's just been, like you said, Tim, a lot of solidarity statements, I think, but there's also, I guess the misconception, one incident after Georgia, the Asian American Studies faculty received a piece of hate mail. It was literally the morning after we found out about the shooting and who was involved. And the faculty, we all came together and we were like, what do we do about this? How can we respond to this? And we ended up writing our own statement of solidarity, right? And our own way of understanding what it means to be Asian American here in the United States, but also here in San Francisco State University. And with that, I think there was just so much grief that week, especially after the shootings. And we really wanted to figure out, like, what can we do as a university and not be also like the folks that have to find out the answers, right? And so I think one thing that was also happening within departments was they were trying to figure out if they should put out a statement of solidarity. And this is from other faculty members that I've heard in other departments that aren't Asian American studies, right? And they would be probably the only Asian American person in their department, or one of few. And they would sit there, and instead of saying, let's write this, this statement, it was like a back and forth of why we should or why we shouldn't. But there were departments who were like, what, we're going to write it. And we're also going to create curriculum, and we're going to create, websites and see how we all can respond together within the classroom, but also in our community. But I think the misconception is also that model minority myth. And we keep saying that, and a lot of folks, like when we first started our Anna Pizzi project 2016, the first day of me going to student affairs, someone asked me, why do we need services for Asian Americans? Y'all are doing fine, right? And this was coming from another Asian American. Mm. And so I was like, wow, and I had to build that relationship to kind of understand where he was coming from, where I was coming from, and why we needed this service here at San Francisco State. But there's also this idea that we're overrepresented and that we're taking over a lot of spots in different colleges or departments. And a lot of students have heard that firsthand, right? And there's also this narrative of Asian Americans in our proximity to whiteness, right? In a lot of the research, we read that. And so thinking about disaggregation of data, like there's so many things, that are institutionalized, that are against, what they believe is standing in solidarity.
I really appreciate these points from both of you. I'm thinking about how along the lines of acknowledging, and then also the institutionalizing the disaggregation of the data, like really recognizing that our stories as Asian Americans are largely like not told. And I think that largely institution administrators don't really know what the needs of their Asian American students really are. We're such a diverse community, and we're all loosely connected with each other, mostly based on legislation, not based on culture, not based on phenotype, not based on language spoken, migration patterns, political history. Like it's really about how we've been racialized in this country because of white supremacy. So I feel like of course, there's so many assumptions. And the idea that generally Asian American students are just low need. They're coming from these, we're seen as like these hardworking immigrant families, and therefore I'm sure you have so much community support. A lot of our work at Hunter is really about finding the students that have been invisible for so long and really have just been overlooked by so many staff and faculty and administrators who don't really, nobody's checking in on them, and they're really struggling. And there's this idea that from a mental health point of view, I'm also thinking that this is a community that doesn't really struggle. We know that all the data goes against that. The high rates of suicide, especially for college students, highest rates of any racial demographic during college. I think for the institution to realize, because of all the stigma, both and because of institutional barriers, Asian American students are the least likely to go see a counselor. So that means that the responsibility to kind of support Asian American students, as well as all other students, really has to fall holistically about their experience within the institution. That means having an Asian American Studies department. That means having Asian American student centers. That means disaggregating the data. That means thinking about whether their advising staff is culturally competent and really recognizes what the long-term needs of these students are. It can't just be like saved for one place. It really has to be like holistically, what is your institution doing to understand who these people are and what they're needing? And just historically, I just don't think that that's happened. It feels like this is such a moment. And Tim, to your point, like, like I was like, there better be a statement. And I wasn't totally sure, like there's not been a conversation about Asian American students and their needs by and large across the country. This feels like such a precious moment that we're all trying to kind of galvanize on, even though, this has been, of course, 100, 200-year issue.
Thanks so much, all three of you, for those really great responses. I'm curious, and I've seen this in my own work too. There's always this sort of hesitancy by universities to speak on matters of Asian American students, and my sense is that I think for many institutions across the country that it really did take a mass shooting for them to be like, oh well, let's think about it first, right? As opposed to not even thinking about it at all. And for those campuses that did finally put out a response, I mean, could you all sort of give us a sense of, did administrators, college leaders learn anything from this experience as they think about moving forward to advance racial equity? Or is it more of like a blip and they sort of have, gone to do their own thing or do something else now?
Well, that's a great question. To be perfectly honest. Well, one thing, I'll just talk about California State University system, but I think it's probably common nationwide how students are basically listed as underrepresented minorities or non-underrepresented minorities. And at least in California, I know that's prominent, and I suspect that's true across the country. And basically, underrepresented minorities are African-American, Latinx, Chicanx, Latinx, Native American. Pacific Islanders sometimes, I suspect that's not true for most of the country. It is in California, but all Asians, and this gets into disaggregation of data, all Asians are considered non-URM, non-underrepresented minorities. And so, I mean, it's a label, but it has meaning. So for example, on campus for years, we've had institutional support for what we call the Martin Luther King Center, which is primarily for African-American students, the Cerna Center for Chicanx, Latinx students. There's the Pride Center, there's a Women's Resource Center, of course, and a broader general, and then a multicultural center, and a new Native American Center on our campus, which it helped that there was like $1 million gift from one of the local tribes that probably moved that one pretty quickly. But there is no Asian Pacific Islander Center, unlike San Francisco State. And I'm not sure exactly what's happening with Hunter or certainly other campuses. They're pretty rare. They're pretty rare. There's movement now, and I think part of it is because of the moment of what's going on, attention to basically equity and attention to API students. I mean, we're not a small minority. We're a fifth of the population. And I've been arguing for a long time, and I have the data. It's from our university. Most people think Asians just go off the charts in terms of graduation rates, because that's basically the national data. But if you look at specific campuses, and I'll only talk about the CSUs, that's not necessarily true. On our campus, and this has always been the case, that Asians have a lower graduation rate than the university average. In fact, on our campus, it's lower than Chicanx, Latinx students. Asian men have a lower graduation rate than African-American men, at least transfer students. And overall, the CSU, I believe the API graduation rate is just tiny bit above, like 1%, but ours is like 5, 6 points lower, 4, 5, 6 points lower. I think I just looked at the latest data for San Francisco State, and it's slightly lower. And that's a big campus, right? There is attention to this. And I think also important is that faculty, staff, and students, API faculty, staff, and students are also feeling the need to mobilize. And I think that's really important. And that's a moment that needs to be captured. Most campuses have started anti-racist committees. And of course, Sac State has one as well. And it's been quite large. And I am very impressed, quite honestly, by the representation of API, faculty, staff, and students on all the various committees. I mean, it's pretty large. And I think that's an indicator of what's going on. But it's not just anti-Asian hate. I mean, obviously Black Lives Matter, anti-immigrant sentiment, all of these are coming together. And I think we'll talk about this a little later on about coalitions between different groups. And I think, I think that this is a moment that things, I hope, can change.
Yeah.
Others, Marcia, Arlene?
I think when Tim was talking, it reminded me of my own childhood. I went to UC Riverside, and UC Riverside has an Asian Pacific American student or Asian Pacific student programs that existed since 1989, right? And the reason why that was created was because of racism on campus against Asian Americans. And usually centers or services for targeted populations is because of one, there's no one to really address the issues that that's happening within their communities in the institution, right? And so when I did my master's thesis on hate crimes on college campuses, 6 different college campuses from the East Coast to the West Coast, and a lot of the time student centers or Asian American studies departments were created because of protest, because of really trying to understand the racism that was happening on with the students, and students were mobilizing. And I think this is, like you said, this is an opportune time to really think about what we have here in place or institutionalized within our own universities that support Asian American students. And if we don't have it, why don't we? And if we do have it, how many people work there? How many people do you have staff there? Because in our Asian American and Pacific Islander student services, there's only 3 of us, and we have about 26% Asian American students on this campus. It is a huge campus. But you can also, rely on your Asian American faculty and Asian American studies to do all the work either. And so I think that's why we need to, really think about this comprehensive response within the entire university, that it shouldn't fall on the cultural taxation of Asian Americans. It should fall on everybody. And so when we talk about equity, we shouldn't just talk about equity as a means for, just putting it on paper. Equity is a means to freedom and liberation. That's what equity is about. So when we say equity and diversity, the result is freedom. The result is liberation. So how are we to be anti-racist in these universities when it upholds whiteness, when it upholds white supremacy? So I think that's where we're at right now. So if we're thinking about reopening plans, right, for the fall, we all want to go back to normal, but we can't. This is even before COVID. Right? We have to really think about and reckon with what is our plans to dismantle white supremacy in these universities. And I think that's where we're at. It's not a misconception. There's racism happening. There's all these intersections happening within our schools every single day, from the hiring, retention, promotion, firing, evaluations, students, acceptance, all of that, testing. There's so much that we have to really think about as a university to understand what our misconceptions are. Or understand what our racist beliefs are. There's a lot of things that we have to do internally to really think about how that's really showing up in our work.
I really appreciate about how micro and how macro this conversation is. It makes me think about in what ways are our administrations really invested? How much do they want to commit to truly being anti-racist? How much do they want to truly commit to expanding the support services as well as the capacity of the university to to be places of wellness and not places of harm for our students and for ourselves. I think that question, it does feel like something is shifting slowly, but I remain a little bit cynical. I think it's going to take some time. It feels like, I think that in the past, there's been this idea that ethnic studies programs are kind of vanity projects. It's just like something on the side. This is for a minor for you to like attach to your real major, which is like economics or psychology. These are the ones that I majored in, instead of these places being, these institutions really become, or they can serve as real, they're supposed to be this place, these homes for self-development and for pride and for finding a way to exist in this world in some kind of meaningful way. I think that people's understanding of how Asian American students are starting not from the same starting line as other students is like, it just feels so new to them to realize that developing these students in the same, or committing to the same kind of healthy racial development and healthy like self-development of these students. This is just not a conversation that's been had before. So I'm hopeful, but I do think that there is, like Arlene's saying, it's just such a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done. And I think it really is about that buy-in, about that commitment. How much am I willing to make whatever the status quo is kind of uncomfortable? How much am I willing to disrupt what's been happening? I do think that a lot of change has come largely out of disruption, out of discomfort. That's what causes people to say, okay, forget it. I will establish this Asian American Studies program. And I'm not totally sure where administrations are on committing to that at this point. But maybe you can be hopeful.
Thanks so much, Marcia, and the three of you. I mean, those are really great responses, and I completely agree. And I wonder, and I guess here's my curveball, I suppose, is you all sort of mentioned sort of the need to sort of come together, to really plant the seed, to have those difficult conversations, to push back against the status quo. But what would you say to your colleagues who aren't at ANAPSIS or campuses, in urban centers where there are other Asian faculty and staff that can come together and support you? What would you tell, your colleagues who might be like the only person of color on their campus trying to do this work, or even campuses with very little resources? How can they begin to do this work or within those circumstances?
I really appreciate this. I'm thinking about, like, Arlene, you were talking about how do you bring this into the classroom? My first thought my first instinct is how much responsibility that as Asian American instructors and faculty members and all the things we feel to provide that sense of mentorship and protection for our Asian American students. I'm thinking about, if you are on a predominantly white or a predominantly non-Asian campus, how much pressure there must be on you to represent and to provide for all the Asian American students, or even for the lack of Asian American students, what that story is supposed to be. And I immediately want to like just comfort that person, knowing like it can't just be on your shoulders. You're fighting against white supremacy at your institution. It can't just be one person. Tim was bringing up coalition building before. I'm thinking about, okay, what are the ways that you can engage in this conversation so that you feel like your humanity as an Asian American professor is alive, that you can at least find some space where, and maybe you're still the only API person there, or maybe that space is also outside of your university. Maybe that's just a reality of the situation. I think maintaining your own sense of, like, a healthy sense of racial pride and sense of community is number one. Then the part is like, okay, then what can you provide for these students? Because I would imagine that if you are the only API person on your campus, people are going to come find you. Students are going to come find you and seek you out because you are just such a important resource for them. And it's much likelier that they'll go to you rather than even to like a counselor or mental health service person. So trying to like acknowledge just the kind of the burden, but maybe also the opportunity, and giving yourself a little bit of a break there to note that like you are yourself also a participant. All of us are not just protecting and trying to provide for our students, but we're also suffering too. Like this is our own like struggle. We're also surviving trauma right now. I think like giving yourself the space for that is crucial.
Marcia.
I appreciate that, Marcia. I think not only are we facing racial trauma, but and grief, we're facing racial fatigue, right? And the fatigue is real, that we're tired, right? Especially if you're going to be the only person on your campus. And I feel for that. And, you know, for SF State, there's about 82% or more students of color. And in 1968, when the ethnic studies strike was happening with the Black Student Union and the Third World Liberation Front, there was only 1% amount of people of color, students of color on this campus. And so I always go back to the foundations of that legacy that, you know, is in San Francisco State, is really galvanizing the community around your university. What does it look like to go outside of the university walls and reach out to the community members that are there? I'm sure we can find pockets of Asian American communities in our cities and learn from what they're going through, learn from what they're doing and their organizations that they've created and the mobilizations that they're doing, and figuring out how we can tap in together. Because I think sometimes universities act in silos within its own county or own region. That we forget that we're part of a bigger community. Like San Francisco is huge. There's a lot of community-based organizations here, and there's so many other folks here. But I'm sure, like in other schools where you are probably the only person, and students may be feeling the same thing, right? Really tapping into those community organizations or communities out there and seeing how we can be together. And I think one thing that I've learned, even if we're in virtual Zoom, Zoom university, we found that coming together even on Zoom has really helped in understanding our own racial trauma, grief, and fatigue. And so when I think about isolation, and we're all in isolation, is really reaching out to community outside of the four walls of the classroom.
Yeah, actually, I know there's going to be some time for audience participation or discussion or some questions, but I'm really interested to hear more about what's happening on other campuses as well. California, we have what's called AB 1460, Assembly Bill 1460, which is now requiring ethnic studies for all students coming in, freshman students coming in fall 2021 on the California State University campuses. And it's a challenge and an opportunity, right? I mean, the reality is that we have to gear up for that. And the good news is we were hiring 2 new faculty members in Asian American Studies because of AB 1460. It wouldn't have happened otherwise. And that is the absolute truth. And then working with other campuses across the CSU, San Francisco State, Sacramento State, we have strong ethnic studies programs. Not every campus does. And in some ways, obviously, collaborating with others on campus, because now the issues are so salient. The anti-immigrant sentiment, police brutality, Black Lives Matter, and now anti-Asian hate. They're all in our faces. And to be able to discuss those and confront those collectively, not in isolation. And there's still a lot of work to be done, for sure. But in some ways, I know Pat Nielsen is here, and some other folks who are other NPZ directors. One of the things we've talked about is regional networks. And it's so easy to be siloed at a university, just on our own campus, let alone individual campuses with other campuses. And I think the need for, or at least attempts to have some sort of, coalitions or cooperatives of institutions be helpful. Again, I'm speaking from California, but there's programs called Puente, which is primarily for Chicanx, Latinx students. And it is very good in networking different campuses. Another program called Emoja, which for African American students. There is nothing like that for API students. And in certain areas, regional makes a lot of sense because obviously with populations. But it's a really good question, how we can work together and not in isolation. And the burden shouldn't be only on the Black faculty member, the Asian faculty member, the staff, the Native American or the Native American or Chicanx, Latinx staff member. And the reality is there are not too many of us in administration. And so you can't count on that at all. So, leadership has to come from the middle and from the center and not rely on the people on top to do it. Because I'm sorry, I don't think that's the focus area.
Great, thanks, Tim. And sort of listening to you all, I'm hearing, Marcia, focusing like on the individual, Arlene about the local community, and Tim thinking about the broader sort of national regional network, which I think is really great. And personally, as a researcher who does a lot of work with MSIs and other colleges, I from what I've known, yeah, leadership is really not the answer. It really does start with us. So I really appreciate you all sort of sharing your insights. And I'm also really mindful of time. And I'm sure there might be folks who might want to engage with you all. So I'm going to sort of transition us to the Q&A.
So we have a question to start. Interested in the programs and support that is available for faculty and staff as they navigate trauma, grief, and fatigue.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question one more time? I didn't catch it.
Sure. Interested in what programs and support are available for faculty and staff as they navigate trauma, grief, and fatigue.
I mean, it depends on the campus. I mean, I don't know. There's a big audience here, which is great. I'm really happy to see that. I'm not sure what's happening on individual campuses. At least on our campus, and I'll just speak for ours, for the initiating API support groups or meetings for grieving sessions for support, we had to organize it. Nobody else did it for us. And I presume that's probably true for other issues as well, or maybe not. I don't know. So, and I guess I would be very concerned if an institution was so short-sighted, and I guess that's not even the best word, that wouldn't recognize the importance of having to confront these issues they're prominent in society. And the university is not an island. The people are not robots, and that they're really important emotions and sentiments that need to be addressed. And big part of that is for others to learn about it as well. I mean, we know among APIs some sort of what's going on, and it's not necessarily universal, but getting, when we had some meetings shortly after the shootings in Atlanta, and it was really nice that we start off meetings not just going right into business, but how are people doing? How are people feeling? And I'm looking at Marcia as a psychologist. I hadn't thought about that before, but how really significant that was.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that a lot of times we think about these academic spaces as not places for mental health, certainly not our own. It's about getting business done. It's like planning for, the next semester and how do we administrate, and pausing to, in some ways, decolonize that space and make it really about us as human beings, that we're trying to cope and we need support from each other. I just want to acknowledge how difficult that is when the culture just isn't there. I mean, for if there is such a space that you can talk with your coworkers about this, with your department about this, that sounds incredible. Like, already that availability and that recognition that this can be a different space sounds necessary, frankly. I just also want to note that, like, for so many departments, it feels like people really try to escape that. I think it's about their own discomfort with bringing in emotions into it. And also, as an East Asian person, like, it's thinking like, this is a place for work. This is not the place for emotions, and we're really trying to push against that all the time, because yes, we are not robots. This is essential to my personhood. I think that there can be spaces. There are some spaces I've seen outside of the institutions. I've seen different support groups that have popped up in my email. I think there is a recognition that this, from a mental health point of view, is a particularly stressful time for Asian American people, including faculty and staff. And seeking out that support outside for yourself might be really necessary, whether that's from a counselor, whether that's from a support group. I know that this conversation is taking place. And if you have the wherewithal to start that conversation on your campus, I mean, incredible. Like, I would love to empower you and encourage you to do it. Don't feel like it has to be your responsibility, of course, but in doing so, you are changing the culture of the institution in this positive way that I think, having these affinity spaces or having these conversation spaces where people can just be their full selves is going to be crucial for the sustainability of not just yourself, but from a capitalistic point of view, for the institution. You really need that. So yeah.
I think for our university, the first thing that we wanted to do is really reach out to all the different services on campus. So we had meetings with like our counseling and psychological services. We had meetings with health promotion and wellness, our division of equity and community inclusion. You know, we were trying to figure out like, what can we all do in response, you know, to all of this for not only our students, but also our faculty and staff and administrators who are going through it, right? With all this racial grief and racial trauma. And I think holding those spaces are so important. And like what Tim said, like we have to do it ourselves, right? Like we have to take that initiative to kind of figure out like, you know, what does our community need? And so when I worked with students firsthand, they were like, well, we want to have our own student forum, no administrators, no faculty, no staff allowed, just us. And I said, okay. I was like, I will help set up a Zoom, and then I'm just going to leave it at that, you know, and you all do what you need to do. And they held two. One was really to just center like your experiences as a student. What are you feeling? Right. The second one was really bringing in all the different student organizations cross-culturally, you know, on our university to bring them into one space and to figure out what can we do to support each other, right? And all of our campaigns and all of the oppressions that we're all facing, because this is not some isolated thing for the Asian American community. Like our common denominator is white supremacy, and we're all feeling oppression in all different sides, all different intersections. And then when they finished those two forums, they gave us these outcomes, right? They had spaces where the students were in breakout rooms and they answered these questions, and they said, here's what the university can do to support our students or us. You know, here are some things that you can do. And then the faculty and staff were like, well, we know our faculty and staff are feeling something because we kept getting emails. You know, like, are you doing anything for faculty and staff? I know we're starting a affinity group for faculty, staff, and administrators. Can we do something? And so that's why we held a separate forum for faculty, staff, and administrators. And that was well attended, not only with Asian Americans, but all, you know, folks from all over the campus, because they, you know, they have Asian American colleagues or they have Asian American students, and they want to figure out what can I do to support our community. Right. And then shortly after the shootings in Georgia, 6 of us Asian Americans came together and we wrote a Senate resolution. And it was unanimously passed just a few weeks ago on Senate, right, to condemn anti-Asian violence and racism on campus. And then what can we do to support, you know, our Asian American and Pacific Islander students on campus, right? So there's all these things moving and there's all these things, these pieces, you know, happening. But this is a long marathon. Yes. Right? Like this has been happening for years and years, even before, you know, this spike in anti-Asian violence. Anti-Asian violence have, like you said, Marcia, it's been for hundreds of years. Right. Right. And so when we think about responses of universities, right, I mean, this is the time. This is the time to really think about, you know, what are our plans for next year? Right. I get it. I mean, like you said, everything is ran on money and capitalism and like filling the seats. Right. But what are we doing to really center love, center wellness, center what's happening in our communities and what we're doing in the university? Because if we're not centering that, then we're dismissing everything that everyone is feeling at this time. So when we come back to school, how are we centering that?
Right, right.
Brandy, maybe one more question.
Sure. And I will add it to the chat in case you need to reference it. How can staff push university leadership to be more vocal about anti-Asian racism, specifically at an institution in which Asians are in the minority?
Well, I mean, one of it is actually developing the relationships with the administrators or people who have, you know, who are in those positions. I just find it really interesting in my experiences when I'm talking with other campuses, and it's like they only know their on sort of the horizontal level, but they really haven't been able to sort of, maybe they're intimidated, I don't know what, but to be able to be able to reach out to administrators. I mean, literally be on a first name basis with the president. And when you send an email, and you don't want to over inundate them, of course, but that this is really important, or even working on the chain. It doesn't have to be just me directly sending to the president, but me sending to somebody who was the vice president for communications, who has the direct ear of the president. And then things sprung out from there. So it's all about networks, and that's true in life. That's true at the university as well. And it is very easy on universities, I understand, to be siloed. That is one of the issues on a university generally. Now is not the time to be siloed. And so in terms of reaching out to your peers, knowing from there who else you can talk to, and move it up in that regard. And it doesn't have to be that slow, but again, now's the time to start making those inroads, because is that in life, networks are important, and in an institution, in the college campuses, it's just as true.
Yeah, I think that coalition building with other groups of color on campus, like really thinking about this as a participatory project for the community at large. Everybody does better when communities of color are supported. Every single person on a campus benefits when they are supported. So this is like, I think like the numbers don't actually matter that much. I mean, sure, you might feel like more confident in saying, this is a larger population, but with that in mind, you have to know that you're entitled to this regardless of what the numbers are. My second thought is that it's a campaign. So don't put too much pressure on yourself to do it all in one day. That to Tim's point, you're cultivating a relationship. And the cynical part, again, of me is thinking, what is it that your administrators are invested in to get that buy-in? I know I worked at different college campuses before, and we were talking about mental health services and how can we get the administrators to devote more money to the mental health services. And if they're afraid about students killing themselves, and that has to be what we're talking about, because that will be an outcome that we will be improving mental health from this point of view. And it's such a crappy way to go at it. It's such a reductive way to think about wellness. But you do have to kind of get to know, like, what is it that our administrators are invested in, so that I can campaign from that angle, which is a desperately terrible place to come from, and also probably a necessary part of capitalism as well. And it's something, I think about frequently.
I agree on both points. I think relationships are key. After the Georgia shooting, we emailed the president right away for a meeting. And the president brought, some of her folks to the meeting to kind of hear what we are going through and what we need. And I thought that was really cool for her to come. And I think we've met twice already since then. But it really is about nurturing those relationships. And I also want to push that, as Asian Americans, we need to fill those leadership roles. I get a lot of us are faculty, our staff, but like what Tim said earlier, not a lot of us are administrators. And so I think that there's a need for that to really change and disrupt systems. We can't do that, if we can't fulfill all the different roles that are happening, within the university. And so, I mean, for us, even writing the Senate resolution, we had to kind of look at data, right? Like, what is the data of faculty and staff to our Asian American students or our students of color? And then we look at administrators, what does that look like in terms of the students of color that we serve every day on this campus? So what does that demographic look like within, the higher levels of administration? Does it represent our student body? And a lot of our students notice that. They're the ones calling that out. They're the ones saying, well, I don't see anyone that looks like me here. So I don't think they understand what I'm going through. And so I think there's so many things that we have to really understand in a university, that even like you said, even if it's like a small minority of us on that campus, our voices need to be heard. But there's also real fear, and I've seen this within our own staff and faculty and administrators, is this fear of retaliation, with their own position or their job, or, retaliation among other staff members, or, other people that they work with in their department. So I know there's so many multiple things that we have to think about when we wanted to work with institutions of power, or even with folks in administration. But like you said, coming together as a community, or even cross-culturally, like, I think we all need to work together to figure out, like, what can the university do to respond to all of our needs.
I just want to emphasize, I think I've been changing over the years, but I think, there's power from, I shouldn't say change. I mean, this is going back to the old roots. I mean, grassroots power. organizing students and then organizing through in the middle, and put the pressure on the administration. It doesn't matter if they're Asian or not Asian. They still need to respond. And quite honestly, I don't know, it depends on your president. I know our president is very sensitive to students. And when there was a meeting with, a large number of API students, it was powerful. Because, quite honestly, in the past, our students haven't spoken up that much. So the fact that they did on various issues that are recently coming up, I think meant a lot, said a lot. And going back to the faculty senate as well, our AB 1460, the passage of ethnic studies had to go through several senate, machinations and everything else. Having students there was so powerful. And I have colleagues there who I like. They're nice people. They're not, they don't agree politically. That's not, that's going to happen. But I will tell you, even they said having the students there made a big difference. I mean, and they can act out any way they want, but they're gonna have to do it in front of students.
Yep.
And that's something they're less likely to do.
Thanks, Tim. Brandy, how much more time do we have? Sorry.
We have 30 more minutes.
Okay, great. So before we get to the next question, I just sort of want to add my thoughts too in my own work. And I agree with Marcia that it really is unfortunate that in order to get things going, you do have to sort of align yourself with the institution's priorities. But I have seen it done and really done really well. And then secondly, related to coalitions, again, in my own work, when Asian American faculty and staff needed to support to sort of get an agenda item, on a board meeting, they had their, other communities of color sort of rally for them. And in part because those communities understood that Asians were seen within this sort of model minority myth, right? And so they had other sort of communities sort of help the administration really understand that Asians needed to be part of this larger discourse related to racial equity. So anyways, so thank you all. Brandy, can we have the next question?
Sure. What are the 3 specific barriers to establishing, supporting, or retaining Asian American ethnic studies at universities, and what are specific solutions?
This is a really interesting question because, again, it does depend on the campus itself. Barriers to, I'll just start with barriers. I'll list one. I don't know if I would have necessarily all 3 because there's a lot, and I'll let other people speak. But one of them certainly is quite honestly the fact that I think a lot of administrators and the model minority image, they're doing well. What do they need this for? And there's everything revolves around budget on a campus. And people always make the budget argument. Oh, well, we don't have enough money to hire more faculty members. That's usually a difficult one. But as I mentioned before, with AB 1460, we had a law behind it. And we're not the only campus, I will say, where ethnic studies faculty are being hired. That includes community colleges. And I will say that the whole push for ethnic studies as a requirement took years. I mean, we can even go back decades if we really want to talk about the Third World Strike at San Francisco State, the whole legislative process. So I'll start with one. It's just basically the arguments around budget, economics, Asian American studies as opposed to a STEM major, STEM faculty member or computer science or something like that. And we put priorities on importance of learning about, how to, your GEs, how to read and write and think critically, quantitative analysis. Ethnic studies should be just part of that as well. It's not separate from what really makes a fully educated college student. That is what part of the undergraduate degree should be. Not just not just I can add and subtract, I can sort of know how to use a library, but also, knowing about different people beyond yourself. That is a significant life skill.
Yeah, it makes me think really about the role of the institution. How do the people really think about what the role of the institution is, what the role of instructors are? I think another, just to piggyback Tim on the model minority myth part, is the part that we're so diverse as a community that I think galvanizing as we have one story and this is the one that's supposed to be told through an Asian American Studies program actually gets really tricky. We have so many stories. How are we gonna wrap our arms around what that is and launch this program that really thoughtfully, considers all the diversity in our community? It's not a bad thing. It's just, I think it's an opportunity. But I think a lot of times there hasn't been this community building on campuses across Asian American ethnic communities, to realize that we need to work together to tell our collective stories together, I think is something that gets a little bit complicated. And then to jump on that as well, I think the perpetual foreigner stuff, people don't recognize Asian American stories as being American stories. And so they don't think of it as having a seat, as a concrete seat within the college curriculum. It's something that's kind of like on the side and it's about some history, but most of these people are like coming in as international students, or they're mostly recently arrived in the US. And there's just this clear breadth of 200 years of history that just gets washed away very quickly. And I think that's part of what's so interesting about this moment, that I think a lot of Asian American students are for the first time identifying as Asian American students, depending on where they're coming from and what their story has been. But that I think a lot of times the university just doesn't perceive this experience or this community as being central to, just as central of a demographic as other student communities.
I think for me, what comes to mind is every time I just ended my last class yesterday, right? And I teach freshmen here at San Francisco State as an Asian American Studies 101 course. And one of the things my students said yesterday was, why did I have to wait till college to take this class or to have this class? Why did I have to wait? And then they started thinking about their communities who cannot go to college, or that they're privileged to be in college to learn ethnic studies. And so a lot of my work, besides being at San Francisco State, is working on K through 12 ethnic studies. And I think we also need to really push K through 12 ethnic studies as a requirement for all students. It shouldn't start in college.
Right.
By that time, we're already thinking about what we want and what we want to do. We need to really think about how we mold our kindergartners or even our preschoolers to really understand the truth and the history and the counter narratives of our people, right? And so they have to wait till college. So I think colleges need to also think about who are in their communities. Like I said, we cannot work in isolation as a university. We have to work with the communities around us. And that includes our unified school districts, right? How do we build bridges between our university to the unified school districts, to community-based organizations, to have this ethnic studies like curriculum, K through college, K through doctorate programs, K through everything, even in our own work, right? And I think it's a privilege to have it in a university, and it's always about budget. And I don't know if in California there's a model curriculum that they've been trying to create for high school, and so that in itself has been co-opted by folks who want the history to be whitewashed, right? There's all these ways of like universities or schools taking the curriculum and then making it something else. So even when you have like ethnic studies, like when the fight with the Black Student Union and the Third World Liberation Front in San Francisco State 50 plus years ago, right? When it became institutionalized within its own university, it also became something else, right? So when we go back to what ethnic studies are, the foundations of ethnic studies, it's about access, it's about relevance, and it's about community, right? And so if we can have access to higher institutions, that's a barrier. There's like not a lot of access for our communities to afford to go to San Francisco State or even live in San Francisco, right? We also have relevance. How relevant is our curriculum, not just in ethnic studies, but in all of our disciplines, right? And then community, right? What are we doing to really figure out like how ethnic studies can be something that everyone can have? And I think those are three barriers I keep thinking about. Like if those were the founding principles of ethnic studies, yet we're still trying to figure out how we're going to provide access, relevance, and community 50 plus years later, like this is going to be an ongoing fight.
Right.
And so we need to work together to really think about like, why is it so important for us to learn our histories? Why it's so important for us to learn about other people's histories? Because if we start young, by the time we're in college, we know how to mobilize, we know how to work with other people, we know how to, everyone's story, but we don't. And I think a lot of the things that are happening in our communities right now, especially for our freshman students, it's new to them.
Right.
and they're just like, this is so new, or is this only happening because of COVID? And then when we show all these different like laws against Asian Americans and policies against Asian immigrants, they're like, what? You mean my grandfather had to go through that? You mean my uncle had to go through that? And so I think that in itself starts to unpack so much anger too. So then you got this angry freshman, college student who's just learning their history today and then wondering why I didn't learn it before. So there's so many barriers, I think, within education itself. But then we also have to think about like, what was education made for?
Right. It makes me appreciate too that Asian American Studies programs and departments are low-key mental health interventions. They are really about developing the holistic wellness of the student, and not just Asian American students. Even if you don't identify as Asian American and you're in one of these classes, you learn something about yourself. It doesn't even have to be restricted to a different community. And I think that in some ways coming from a mental health point of view, we've really siloed mental health as just being the counseling center. And I know I said this before, but like, if the institution can understand itself to be much more about the holistic development of the student in these non-traditional mental health spaces, I think that Asian American Studies becomes more and more, not just relevant, but just like absolutely essential to the health of your student population.
Yep.
What I've noticed with some universities is that they are committed to Asian American Studies, and they'll provide either a minor or a major pathway, but they have like a really hard time actually hiring faculty for these programs, and they continue to say things like, well, there's just not enough like qualified applicants. Like, what would you say to that? What would you tell administrators or the folks hiring or trying to hire, right, these faculty?
I mean, the criteria that they're using, I would imagine, are value-laden in some way. And so really interrogating themselves about how are they defining this? I mean, clearly there will be something about Asian American instructors that they can provide personally that's based on their development as a person to these students. I don't know how much that's getting assessed. I'm curious to know like what kind of criteria people are using and how they're assessing for this person's their expertise in some ways. How are we defining expertise?
Tim, Marlene?
Yeah, that's also an issue that's being raised because again, the law initially is for CSU to have ethnic studies, and so hiring has been done or is being done. There is movement also in the community colleges, but we're hearing a lot about the same thing. And at the same time, we don't think ethnic studies should be, anybody can teach ethnic studies. There needs to be really a more fundamental philosophical, theoretical background behind it. So just because you have a course in, and I don't want to offend anybody, in another discipline, and let's just call it ethnic studies because we throw in something about Asians, that's enough. And so, and I think the other part of it too is this may be something that's going to grow itself. I mean, the reality is, if there are students who are taking ethnic studies courses either in primary school and then getting into colleges, that'll start growing, sort of the momentum towards people, and they can either major or get their degrees in ethnic studies or another discipline, but have a very strong ethnic studies or Asian American studies bent. I mean, it is a long-term issue. I wouldn't even call it a problem. Quite honestly, I think it's something, but it's something we can start growing. I'm looking at it as an opportunity as well. And I think prior to this, there were probably a lot of ethnic studies, people with that background who didn't have work, in what they wanted to do. And now I think there are those opportunities, and I guess there'll be mentoring and things along the way. I mean, I agree. Not just anybody can teach ethnic studies. Not just anybody teach Asian American studies.
Sure.
I certainly want to have some quality control over that.
I also think, it just depends on what their standards are when they're doing the hiring. I mean, there's a lot of bias in hiring as well, and hiring, promotion, retention, all of that. And I also think that when we think about barriers, those are barriers too, like barriers to ethnic studies. And I'm wondering, like, how many of us, like in ethnic studies programs, hired the community organizer or hire the, you know, the community activist,
Right.
right? That doesn't have a lot of publications. You know what I mean? I think there's all these different standards that we hold folks accountable to, or these expectations of what a ethnic studies professor or even just a professor in general, right? Like there's all these different criteria. Or they don't want to hire their own graduate or alumni, or there's all the, you know, there's always something, right? And I think there's no, from sitting on like, you know, hiring committees, or even just seeing folks that are graduating with ethnic studies degrees and not having tenure track positions, or not getting tenure track jobs, right? Or even going into tenure track jobs and not feeling supported, you know, as a person of color or as an Asian American person in those disciplines. Right. So I think there's so much more to that question, but I think, I guess it depends on each school site. It depends on the hiring committee, right? It depends on their standards or expectations. And sometimes people would say like ethnic studies can get co-opted, you know, from folks who may look like us, but don't have the background to understand the critical analysis of how we need to look at the world. Right. And so even just when we're trying to go K through 12 and hire teachers there, you know, we can't just get any teacher to teach ethnic studies, like Tim said, you know, like we really need to figure out like what is the criteria. But then here, you know, we have, if we're growing these students, you know, from K through college, that there's more opportunities and there's more ways to define what that could look like for the future. So my own children take ethnic studies, right, in their elementary school and also in their middle school. And when they're having this critical awareness or this critical worldview, and they're speaking to teachers who have no background in ethnic studies, and they're like, whoa, how do you know all this stuff? Mm-hmm. That they're constantly pushing and asking questions, right? About why is this test, you know, why do we need to take this standardized test? My daughter had to go take standardized tests today. And she said, why are they making us do this post-COVID? Like, you know, it doesn't make any sense for us. Like we're all going through something mentally, emotionally. We're all middle schoolers, right? But at the same time, I'm wondering what her life would be like after she goes to college. Because I had to wait till I went to college to get ethnic studies, you know, and so I'm wondering what this new generation or our future would look like when they assume positions now that they have this experience with taking ethnic studies as students and taking ethnic studies as a discipline or a major or a minor, right? So I think it really depends on each school, like how they would do it, but I think the future, there's hope for the future.
Really good thoughts. Thank you all. Actually, I do want to add to that really quickly, and just say I do want to go into the next question, but I do want to say I think that what I'm hearing, you know, but from all of you is, you know, Tim, certainly we do want standards. There should be some criteria for who the folks are to teach these courses. But then to Marcia and Arlene's point, you know, I think we do need to sort of question, you know, the assumptions that undergird the idea of eligibility and who's qualified, because I've seen, you know, universities, many of them elite, I won't name them, but, you know, they'll say, oh, well, this person's really not qualified to teach Asian American studies, even though they have a degree in Asian American studies. We prefer this person who has done a more traditional route in either history or anthropology. So it's very much removed. And so it's not just enough to say we have Asian American courses, but we have to think about who's being brought in to actually teach and support the students that are enrolled in these courses. So thank you all for those thoughts. Brandy, could we have the next question?
Sure. I'm from a PWI. Can you talk about how to navigate anti-Asian hate, racism, and support for students at an institution who is still only operating in a Black-white binary?
Mm-hmm. Great question.
Yeah. That Black-white binary is so hard to break. It really is just still new that we're trying to stretch this just a little bit. Like, white supremacy is far more creative than a binary. It's so insidious. And I'm just, I'm sitting with how much responsibility you might feel, this person might feel about introducing that conversation. And I think it does fall again about establishing the fact that Asian American students have needs, and that we are not, while there is some proximity to whiteness for sure, we also need to talk about the historical exclusion of this is part of how anti-Asian racism persists, exclusion from this conversation. Trying to school everybody on racial triangulation is not an easy feat. That is something that takes years. It is, again, a campaign, and probably echoing from what we've said before about coalition building. Like, you can't do this on your own. I think presenting a much more nuanced model, on the one hand, encourage you to do it and find people to help you do it. On the other hand, it will take the administration choosing to listen to you too. And you can't also have that on your shoulders all the time. That can't be, I mean, I get that we need to chip away at this, but allowing yourself a little bit off the hook, I think, is important too, because that just can't be something that you have to own.
I agree. I think students, Tim said it earlier, like there's a lot of power with students. We really need to figure out like how to not organize the students, but bring, all of us together. I'm sure there's a small population somewhere in your university, whether it's students, faculty, or staff, will find some camaraderie within our community, but also like working, cross-culturally, intersections. I think we need to really think about how we support each other. If there's a response for other marginalized or oppressed groups on campus, what can we do to include, Asian Americans and on our campus as well? But I think that's hard. Like you said, it's hard to teach everything about racial triangulation within a PWI. I don't know what that's like, because San Francisco State, I mean, we keep pushing, we just keep saying it, but it is tiring, and it does have that racial fatigue, or even you feel like I'm the only API speaking up about it. What can I do? And I think this is a very good question. It's also a very hard question to answer. I think navigating an institution that was not meant for us is hard enough, as a collective, but even harder if you're alone. So I would just encourage finding the collectivity or the collectivism within the campus for folks who are allies. We really need to find our allies that are there. They don't necessarily have to be Asian American, right? Like, I think there's so many other folks that are there that can really side with you and help you navigate that system as well.
Yeah, the black-white binary, I think, is such the challenge, and particularly outside of the probably the coastal areas, certainly California. I mean, I got my PhD in ethnic studies. Ron Tukaki was one of my professors, and way back when he was talking about, moving beyond black and white, looking at America as it really is. Obviously, it's a little different in other places, but I think we're mentioning that allies don't have to be just Asian API people. I think they're good people on all campuses. I think there are some folks who aren't so great, but you find the ones who are supportive, who are willing to learn, who are open-minded. And again, that's part of leadership in the middle. And choosing your battles and choosing who your supporters are. And even aside from PWIs, I mean, there are MSIs that don't have much API populations. And so again, this is a societal focus. But I'm hoping, again, we have a different administration now, that there's more modeling of that broadly. Yeah, but things change, all the time. And I think that's one thing I will say. I'll just end with this. Martin Luther King holiday, is always very special. It's always a reflective time for me, and I'm familiar with all the speeches and the famous quotes. But there was one I didn't know about, and then I just happened to find on the web. And I don't have it memorized, I should have, but it's something to the effect that we can't give in to finite disappointments or challenges, but we must focus on infinite hope. And I mean, for some reason this year, it really hit me more than anything else. And so again, being reflective of the opportunities, being aware of the challenges, but also the moments of opportunities that will always be there. And as we know, will come at different times. It's just being ready for it.
I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Sure. How do Asian Americans address our anti-Black/brown family members, and even wider alt-right Asian supporters?
A good question.
Yep.
Good question.
And an easy one. I'm just kidding.
And an important one. I mean, it is true. I mean, we can't deny that there's
100%.
Racism among API populations, and in some ways helping to fuel some of the hate sentiments that are not just white Asian. And so, but again, I'm not sure what's happening in New York, because I know you mentioned there's been some attention to that. There was a lot in LA during the LA riots as well, but much less attention on Asians for Black Lives, for example. Asians, for immigration reform and coalitions that are built because of deportations of Southeast Asian refugees for a crime they committed, 20 years ago. And I just always like to highlight the fact that, after 9/11, and there were calls to round up all Muslim Americans and put them in concentration camps, just like Japanese, that it was the Japanese American Citizens League that came out in support. And at least I can speak for Sacramento, that connection is so tight right now. The Muslim community and the Japanese American community is very strong. They bring each other together for Muslim holidays. And another example is that there's annual pilgrimages to internment camps, and they're Muslim American organizations that come along with that as well. And this is after 9/11, so it's been a while, but that connection is still there. That connection is very strong. So that, to me, is a really good example of how coalitions can be built and can be sustained.
Yeah, I know we've been talking a lot about, like, okay, if you're the only person, you need to find folks that are from Black and Latinx communities on your campuses, and it needs to go both ways. We need to support each other. I think we have a responsibility to our Black and Latinx siblings to speak out. I think that there are so many ways to talk about this. My first thought is just like, every day there is an opportunity for you to talk to your family members about this. You don't have to wait for George Floyd to be murdered in broad daylight. You can talk about this every single day. Oh, I noticed you said that. Tell me more about it. I think one of the hardest things about investigating racism is feigning curiosity when you're totally disgusted by what the other person is saying. But we're all in kind of unique positions where we do have access to Asian Americans who have anti-Black attitudes. And I do think that maybe I have a little bit more wherewithal to have that conversation with this cousin of mine than maybe I do somebody random on the street. I have to kind of use that wherewithal. It's not my responsibility to change every single anti-Black Asian American person, but I have an opportunity here, and this can be something I step into. I think that the again, and I keep saying the word campaign, like, this is not a one-time conversation where you leave feeling, a valiant victory and that's it, you solved it. I think it's about representing yourself as somebody who's going to make them feel uncomfortable, and you're going to feel uncomfortable, and normalizing that within your relationship. I think that can go a really long way.
I really appreciate this question. I'm glad someone asked this question as well. Last summer, we hosted an event with community-based organizations like Pinoy Pinay Educational Partnerships, Asian Solidarity Collective, Pinayista, and our organization, or our department here at SF State, on Filipinx for Black Lives, right? And really understanding, that our liberation is tied to Black liberation, right? And these are some of the enduring understandings that we came up with as a collective to really think about how to decolonize from our own colonial mentality, right? That we really need to start with ourselves to really unlearn our anti-Blackness and our anti-racism. Really, what do we believe in, right? Before we even get into conversations with our own family members, we need to understand, where are we coming from? What do I believe in, right? And really start thinking about, not really centering yourself in the movement for Black lives, but self-actualization, right? We really need to figure out how we are a part of, this bigger community actualization. That solidarity is action rooted in humanization and empathy. This purposeful process that needs for us to call our communities. And it's hard to have those conversations with our family members, especially the ones that voted for Trump, especially the ones that are saying racist things at the dinner table. Those are the things that we need to reckon with every single day. And if we can't do that in our dinner table, then what makes us think we can do that in the universities we work in or in the classrooms that we're in, right? And also, going through training is not enough. Like Marcia said, it's not a one-time thing. I can't just go to one training and say that I'm anti-racist. This is life work. This is a struggle that we have to, really think about every single day. Who am I? Who am I to the movement that's happening in the world, right? What is my understanding and worldview of, how I understand history, who's teaching me this. Like there's so many questions that you have to be critical about, for yourself, for your families, your communities, and who you align yourself with when it comes to solidarity. So if you say you're solidarity, in solidarity with people and communities, it should be more than performative activism. It should be more than a post. It should be that work, that struggle, to really have those convos. And as a person that teaches oral communications, that's one of the challenges I gave my students. Like during the elections last year, have those conversations with your family. How do we use our oral communication or our communication skills to really talk about these issues and bring it out?
Thank you, the three of you, for just, again, your time and for sharing your expertise and insights with us. I'm sure I speak on behalf of everyone in the audience that they have learned a great deal. And I know we're at the end, so I again want to thank the Proctor Institute, especially Brandy Jones, for supporting us today. And to the audience, thank you so much for making the time to be in community with us. And I hope that today's conversation has informed how you might think about moving forward on your own campuses, as well as in your own personal professional life. Thank you and have a great day.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.